It was one of the most spectacular disasters.
And a shout down the telephone, ice ahead. The time was 11:40.
The supposedly unsinkable Titanic, sailing on its maiden voyage across the Atlantic, sank.
The great ship went down after striking an iceberg.
But was it really the Titanic that sank? Or was it its damaged sister ship, the Olympic, sunk intentionally to claim the insurance money and keep the White Star Line afloat? My name's Lani, and you don't know me yet, but I'm a conspiracy enthusiast. I'm interested in conspiracies, but I don't necessarily believe that they hold water. I'll be back here every week with a new weird thing to talk about, so if you like weird stuff, then subscribe and keep up with it. And if you like this video while you're watching, then give it a thumbs up because it would really help me out and that would be cool. Today we're diving into the switch theory, as it's commonly referred to. This is the conspiracy theory that the Titanic was switched during construction with its sister ship, the Olympic, which had run afoul of another ship and been found at fault by the insurance company, meaning that White Star Line, the company that owned these luxurious ocean liners, would have its pockets gouged for repairs. The theory, which was popularised by the author Robin Gardner, basically claims that the two ships were switched. The patched up Olympic sailed off under the name Titanic, and the Titanic, all shiny and new, went off to work as the Olympic, like nothing had happened. The plan was then to orchestrate a controlled accident which had other ships in on the scheme, apparently, who would be standing by to rescue the passengers so that only the now defunct ship would sink to the bottom of the ocean and nobody would be the wiser. White Star Line could collect their insurance money, the shiny brand new Titanic could carry on functioning as the Olympic, while the real Olympic became crab food at the bottom of the ocean, and corrupt rich men could rest easy, knowing that they didn't lose as many dimes as they were going to. It seems like a neat enough idea, but much like the actual Titanic, it has quite a few holes in it. We're going to get into this theory in a second, but first let's talk about the Titanic. The Titanic was actually the second of 3 Olympic-class ocean liners, the first of which was obviously the Olympic, and at the time it was the largest ship in the world. It was fitted to carry 3,547 people in speed and comfort, with the passenger accommodation said to be quite nice, especially the parlour suites, which were the most expensive suites on the ship. For a one-way ticket in one of these suites cost $4,350 back then. Nowadays, that would be around about $115,000 one way. Even the third class, which obviously was way less luxurious, was still a vast improvement on many of the passengers' lives. So it was like, it was a little treat, you know? When the Titanic set sail across the Atlantic, she was carrying 892 crew members and 1,320 passengers, which was only about half her full capacity. This was partly due to a coal strike that had happened and actually only ended a couple of days before the Titanic set sail, but it was also not as exciting as maybe James Cameron would have you believe. Because the Titanic was the second of these ships to launch, all the fanfare had kind of been on the Olympic when it had launched before, and now it's kind of just like, oh, there's another one. So even though this ship was actually kind of a bit more luxurious, it was kind of considered a bit less special and exciting. The Titanic carried not only distinguished members of Edwardian society, but it also carried just a variety of people, including poor immigrants from countries like Armenia, Ireland, Italy, Sweden, Syria. So it had quite a variety of people on board. The ship's captain was 62-year-old Edward Smith, who had like 4 decades of experience at sea. He was actually the captain of the RMS Olympic before being transferred onto the Titanic. Why'd they transfer him off the Olympic, I wonder? Oh no, oh no, oh no, no. One of the things I want to do in this video is go through bit by bit what caused the Titanic to be such a massive disaster and examine the historical facts that we actually have before we actually get into the conspiracy. Because once I started looking into this, I realized I didn't know a ton of this stuff. So one of the key components of the Titanic's downfall was the crew. Most of them weren't actually trained sailors. They were mostly made up of engineers, firemen, stokers, stewards, that sort of thing. The Titanic had 6 watch officers and 39 able seamen. This was only about 5% of the crew. To add to that, a lot of the crew members actually embarked on the very last stop that the Titanic made before it set off. So they had a very short amount of time to familiarize themselves with the ship before they were out in open water. Something else a bit spicy that happened is there was a fire in the coal storage that started like 10 days before the ship left its dock in Belfast, and it actually continued for several days once they'd left. So I guess they were just like, yeah, no, it can be on fire. That's okay. I didn't know this, but it does make sense. Coal fires are incredibly hard to put out because coal's like so combustible. There's a coal fire in Pennsylvania that's been burning for like 50 years.
You can't get rid of me, bitch!
The only real way to deal with the coal fire at the time in this confined space on a ship was to just like take the burning coal, shovel it into the furnace, and that was the safest way to get rid of it. So that's what they did. Now, this shoveling of the coal en masse into the furnace was actually believed to cause the next issue. Although the Titanic had received a bunch of warnings of sea ice from other ships in the area, more on that later, the Titanic was barreling ahead. It was almost traveling at its top speed. It was doing 22 knots, which for a massive ocean liner like that, it was maybe like, its top speed would have been maybe like 25, 26. Modern ocean liners do about 25 to 30 knots, and that's their maximum speed because these ships aren't built for speed, they're built for comfort. But again, for such a massive ship, like this ship was 800 feet long, that's hugely fast. Because it was going so fast, by the time the crew actually noticed the iceberg, it was too late to completely turn out of the way. The ship managed to veer off, so they didn't hit the iceberg head on, but they hit it on the starboard side. I don't actually know which side that is. I probably should have researched that. I researched literally everything else. I don't know which side, but it hit it on a side, the starboard side, and it basically scraped along the side of it, denting, buckling, and gouging at its walls. It caused a length of damage that was about 300 feet, which is almost half the ship's total length. This wasn't a continuous rip, it was various stages of ripping, because remember, icebergs aren't, uniform structures, they're organic structures. So it was a variation of damage all throughout the ship in that 300 feet, but it was a massive area. The ice conditions in the North Atlantic, where the Titanic was, at the time was worse than it had been for 50 years. Because of course it was. So the crew and the lookouts wouldn't have necessarily been thinking like iceberg, 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 because they weren't used to there being so much ice there. Those sea ice warnings the other ships in the area so helpfully provided to the Titanic, yeah, not a lot of them made it to the captain. There were 6 warnings in total and only 2 of them actually ended up getting to the captain. So that's fun. That was because the radio operators weren't actually crew members of the Titanic. They were employed by a telegraph company. So their priority wasn't radio messages for the crew, it was sending telegrams for people. As soon as the Titanic struck its fated iceberg, it began to rapidly take on water. It took on water originally at 7 long tons per second. What's a long ton, you ask? It's a ton, just a bit longer. No, I'm not kidding. This was 15 times faster than they could pump that water out. So from the get-go, it wasn't looking good, and unfortunately it only got faster. Rather than focus on pumping out the water, the crew actually moved their attention to trying to contain the damage away from the boilers, because they were worried that the freezing water hitting, like obviously the boiling hot boilers, would cause an explosion. So they did their best to try and contain that damage away from the boilers while they could power the boilers down and reduce the heat so that when the freezing water did eventually hit them, it wouldn't be as catastrophic. Some survivors said that at this time when they hit the iceberg, they felt like a large shudder. One person said that it felt just as though going over 1,000 marbles, which kind of reminds me of like turbulence on a plane. So it doesn't surprise me that most passengers kind of brushed this off. And most of them were actually in bed anyway, because it was about midnight. So within 45 minutes of the collision, it became very clear to the crew that the ship was sinking. Like, it was not going to be okay. They started alerting passengers and coordinating evacuations. There was no public speaker system on the Titanic because it's 1912, so they went door to door. In first class, this played out very cordially. Knock on the door, go in, help them get dressed, escort them out onto the deck. In second and third class, it was kind of just like bang, 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 open up the door, oi, out you come, meet us on the deck. They didn't tell anyone the ship was sinking, which I guess makes sense. They wouldn't want anyone to panic. But the urgency of the situation was kind of lost on them, which led to a lot of the passengers and even some crew members like not really wanting to comply with these orders. It was freezing, it was the middle of the night, like they were in bed, they were cozy. They didn't want to get out. This was the unsinkable ship. How bad could it be? You know what I mean? So a lot of them just stayed in their cabin where it was nice and warm and cozy and they were comfortable, instead of like the freezing night air. For a long time, even the passengers that were on the deck kind of weren't even taking it seriously. If you watch, like you can watch the Titanic sink in real time, and it took a long time for it to kind of look serious. So some of the passengers that were on deck were actually playing soccer with the chunks of ice that were strewn across the deck from the massive iceberg that they'd hit, which just sounds like a bit of fun. I hope they survived. One of the ways they attempted to prevent the boilers from exploding when they came in contact with the freezing water was to vent them en masse. This created a deafening noise above deck. where all the passengers were, where they were coordinating the evacuation effort. One of the passengers described it as 20 locomotives going off all at once. It was so loud that the crew had to communicate using hand gestures, which I'm sure just made it so much easier in the middle of the night in 1912 with 20 locomotives going off, with passengers who weren't taking it seriously, coordinating a rescue effort that they didn't know how to do. Sounds easy, sounds chill, sounds great. Sign me up. So one of the commonly known facts about the Titanic, I feel this is one of the things I knew about the Titanic before I started researching this, was that there weren't enough lifeboats on board. This wasn't exactly part of a conspiracy to protect like the wealthy and leave the poor people to rot, even though that's kind of how it worked out anyway. This was actually fairly standard practice for most ocean liners. Of the 39 British ocean liners operating at the time, 33 weren't carrying enough lifeboats. And this is because the lifeboat evacuation procedure was more or less designed so that they would ferry the passengers off the sinking ship or the damaged ship to an awaiting rescue vessel that was already there. They weren't designed to evacuate a complete ship all at once. I'm not really sure why. You'd think, but I mean, clearly they didn't. White Star Line in particular placed a priority on the luxury of the liners. So they didn't want like a bunch of lifeboats blocking the pristine ocean views that they got. I mean, you'd hate that, right? I'm sure the passengers appreciated it before half of them died. The Titanic had 20 lifeboats total, and each of them could hold, I think, 68 people, which weirdly enough altogether is like 1,360, which is 40 more people than the passengers that they had at the time. There was of course the crew to think about, so this was like 2,212 people altogether. So there are a few ifs to consider here. Like imagine if they had filled every lifeboat to capacity, which they definitely didn't do, and I'll get into the reasons why. But imagine that, they would have saved so many more people. On the other side of that, imagine if they'd been traveling at complete capacity when this happened. It would have been a gigantic disaster. They might have lost 2,500 people instead of 1,500. So a couple of things got in the way of the lifeboats being used to their maximum effectiveness. One was the way that they were stored. They were stored in kind of a hard to access way. On either side of the ship, there were 8 lifeboats on davits. I'm not sure how to say it, but it's basically the little winch thingy that the lifeboat's on that you launch it out into sea with. However, blocking these boats in was a collapsible boat, which had a wooden bottom but canvas sides. And you actually had to remove those collapsible boats, set them up and get them out of the way so that you could get to the davits. This doesn't sound too difficult. However, each one of those collapsible boats weighed several tons, so it kind of got in the way of the evacuation a little bit, slowed them down a little bit. They didn't think about it. There was also very little lifeboat training for both the crew and the passengers. Like I said, the crew got on very late. There was only one lifeboat drill before the Titanic left its final dock and set off sail. They launched 2 boats, both just with experienced seafaring crew members. They rode around for a bit, chucked them back on the ship and went, yep, no, that's good. The passengers had not been subject to a lifeboat drill. There was actually one planned for one of the mornings before this crash happened, and it was cancelled. Don't know why, there's no explanation of that. So while some of the passengers who had been aboard a ship before, been aboard a luxury ship before, would have been subject to other lifeboat drills maybe, a lot of them wouldn't have, especially the second and third class passengers who had maybe never been on a ship before. It's also worth mentioning that because most of the crew weren't seaworthy, they didn't even know how to row a boat, let alone conduct a massive lifeboat evacuation in the middle of the night with screaming vents going off outside. A Titanic historian named Thomas E. Bonzel has said that even if they had the number of lifeboats necessary to save everyone on board, it's very unlikely that they could have launched them in time. And actually they didn't even get to launch the lifeboats that they had in the first place. So he's got a good point. And I mean, he is a Titanic historian, so he does have some authority. I don't know why I'm judging this man. Like, yeah, no, he's got a point. So there were 2 main players in the evacuation effort, in addition to Captain Smith, who was obviously coordinating the whole thing, First Officer Murdoch and Second Officer Lightoller. These 2 officers, First and Second Officer, were in charge of the deck along with Captain Smith. So over the ear-splitting noise, Lightoller shouted to Captain Smith, "Hadn't we better get the women and children aboard the boats?" Smith agreed and then ordered the 2, who were each coordinating one side of the evacuation, to put women and children in and lower away. But the 2 men interpreted these orders differently, and it led to some heavy consequences. Murdoch interpreted this order as women and children first. Lightoller interpreted this as women and children only. So while Murdoch prioritised women and children, but still allowing some men to board when there were empty seats and there were no women and children waiting, Lightoller allowed no men to board. even if there were empty seats. Both men actually lowered half-full lifeboats, so they could have piled on a lot more people than they actually did. The first few lifeboats only held about 25 people. This isn't necessarily their fault though, because neither of them knew how many people those lifeboats could safely hold. I feel like this could have been remedied with some actual lifeboat training, so they were just guessing. And like, obviously you wouldn't want to overburden lifeboats in the middle of the night in the freezing North Atlantic, so like, I get it. It's just one of those unfortunate dominoes that fell and contributed to this being such a huge loss of life. It's estimated that if all the lifeboats had been filled, an extra 500 people could have been saved. A lot of passengers actually didn't even want to get in the lifeboats at first because, again, it seemed to them like the Titanic wasn't even that badly damaged. All the damage was underneath the ocean. They couldn't see that much. There was a bit of ice. It was kind of listing a bit. It took some urgency out of it for a lot of the passengers who weren't privy to this key information that the crew knew 45 minutes in. Yes, it's going down. Millionaire John Jacob Astor actually declared to everyone standing around him, "We are safer here than in that little boat." And yeah, he did die, just in case you were wondering. His wife survived though, so I guess she didn't share his views. While all this was going on, officers and radio operators were sending out distress signals either by using the radio or by using distress flares and rockets. A nearby ship actually saw some of these rockets. The SS Californian, which had been one of the vessels that had warned Titanic about the sea ice earlier, was caught in a large field of ice itself, and its captain, Stanley Lord, had decided to shut down operations for the night and just start again in the morning when they had a full view of the ice. I hadn't mentioned this yet, but that night that the Titanic sank was actually extremely clear. There was very low wind, which meant that the visibility of ice was extremely poor because there was no like wind pushing the tide up against the ice so you could see where the ice was. The reflection made it just look like water, so it was very tricky. So Captain Lord decided, we're just gonna stick it out. We'll stay here in this ice field and we'll start again in the morning when we can actually see what we're doing. The radio operator on the Californian actually shut down their radio like 10 minutes before the Titanic hit the iceberg. Man, this story is so full of these things where just like domino after domino after domino after domino had to fall, and it was like on the bridge of the Californian, the third officer actually witnessed the crash of the Titanic. He just didn't know that that's what he was witnessing. He saw a massive vessel off in the distance turn really sharply, or as sharply as a ship of that size could turn, and then come to a complete stop. It's unclear what he did with this information. He must have just been like, huh, that's weird. And about an hour later, the second officer saw 5 rockets fire up out of that same ship. He then reported this to the captain, who didn't act on it. He was kind of like, eh. But he was judged really harshly, obviously, for this later on, not acting to rescue the Titanic. But I think it's worth mentioning that the Californian was trapped in a bed of ice itself. Like, they might have caused even more catastrophic loss of life if they tried to rescue the Titanic, because they were also surrounded by ice. The second officer was disturbed by this, and he said to another officer, obviously not to the captain because you don't want to talk back, a ship is not going to fire rockets at the sea for nothing. But sadly, in the end, nothing was done by the Californian, and they all just went to bed. So back aboard the Titanic, the crew were scrambling to either contain the damage, signal for rescue, or coordinate the evacuation of the passengers. Well, I mean the first and second class passengers, mostly. Many of the third class passengers didn't even make it above deck, partly because of the way the ship was designed, and partly because it seemed like some of the crew members actively kept them down there. Also, a lot of them didn't speak English, so that it was hard for them to understand the instructions in the first place. A lot of the third class passengers who did survive were actually Irish immigrants, which makes sense because they could speak English and they could understand what people were saying, whereas people from Armenia maybe didn't necessarily understand what was happening. People who did manage to make it into lifeboats watched the people on deck huddle together as the ship slowly tilted, eventually throwing them into the freezing water. Some lifeboats attempted to save those in the water, and others decided not to because they didn't want to take the risk of like upending the lifeboats, trying to like, if people like rushed the lifeboats trying to get in. Most of the people who were dumped in the freezing water, they died there. The survivors who were left, who had quite literally witnessed the deaths of 1,500 people. For a long time, they could hear people screaming while they slowly froze to death. And a lot of the survivors' accounts talk about just how distressing that was. One of the crew members who was in a lifeboat, it had some passengers in it that wanted to go rescue people. He said that there were only corpses there. I can only imagine the impact that that would have on your mental health, especially in 1912. I know I keep mentioning that it was 1912, but like, it was 1912. It's not exactly like they could go see a therapist after all this. About 2.5 hours after the Titanic first hit the iceberg, it finally disappeared below the surface. About an hour and a half after that, they were finally rescued by the RMS Carpathia. All in all, the wreck of the Titanic claimed over 1,500 lives, Interestingly enough, I couldn't find an exact number, even though there were an exact number of crew members. Everyone was documented, but the number of deaths is actually unclear. I'm not sure why. Many of them were crew members, third-class passengers, and particularly men from the second class. So the thing that's strange to me about this particular conspiracy theory is that there is so much information available about the Titanic. You are quite literally swimming in it. The things that I've gone over here are just like a fraction. I had to edit so much out for time, and I'm sure that we were already here forever. So why in this wealth of information are there no details of the massive undertaking that swapping two gigantic ocean liners would be? There are no credible reports of workers sworn to secrecy, no instances of subterfuge or people who witnessed him doing weird stuff. Theoretically, the captain would have to be in on it. And the crew also wasn't doing anything hanky in the lead up to what was supposed to be a planned crash. Even if you posit that the crash was planned and the iceberg was an accident, they would have had to be doing something to prepare for this planned crash. Like, that's a big undertaking. So we're gonna examine some claims. We're gonna just go over the main ones. There's like so many. There's so many. And if I went through every single one of them, we'd be here forever. But a lot of them hinge on one of the other claims being true. So I'm just going to try and focus on the claims where everything sort of depends on them being true rather than every single one. So the switch theory was popularized, like I said, by Robin Gardner in his book titled Titanic, the Ship That Never Sank. It was published in 1996. He was a conspiracy theorist, but he was also a very well-educated man. He was an engineer. Like, that's a hell of a day job. He was fascinated by the Titanic as a kid, and I guess never really grew out of it. So as far as the claims go, we're going to go through the claims first, and then I'm going to go back and address them and talk about people who've refuted them and evidence to the contrary, all that sort of stuff. So the first one is the striking similarity between the two ships. Gardner posits that changing one ship to look like the other and the other one to look like the first one wouldn't actually be that difficult. And the Olympic's collision, the one that put her out of action, Gardner's evidence included claims that the Olympic's keel had been bent and its central turbine mountings had been damaged. He claims that very few parts of the ship actually bore the name and the ship number of the Titanic, and that the name Titanic had been riveted onto the ship on a plate rather than engraved and painted into the ship, as was like customary for most ships, especially for the ships in the White Star Fleet. This was obviously because, according to the theory, it had been the Olympic, so they just slapped a plate over the top, covering the word Olympic and making it the Titanic. Gardner also pointed out sea trials for the Titanic. The Olympic sea trials had lasted 2 days, included very high speeds. Titanic's trials only lasted for 1 day. And Gardner alleges, with no evidence, mind you, that there were no high-speed runs. He claims that this was because the Titanic was obviously, according to this theory, the damaged Olympic, so it actually couldn't reach this high speeds. Again, this is all alleged. This is where it starts to get a little far-fetched, but Gardner actually also claims that the Titanic did not hit an iceberg at all, that it actually hit another ship that has been strategically moved in front of the Titanic. He says that it's strange that the lookouts didn't notice the iceberg sooner, and that it must be because there was no iceberg at all. He also did not believe that an iceberg could damage a steel double-hull ship so badly. Gardner reckons that the ship, the Titanic here, was actually what the Californian saw, the one with the rockets that came to a stop. He also said that this explains the inaction of the Californian when it saw the rockets, because they were in on it, they knew it was going to be fine. The ice on the deck, Gardner explains this away. He says that it's ice from the rigging of the Titanic and the mystery ship smashing together, causing ice to fall. Now, when I mentioned that Gardner popularized this theory, that's because it was actually suggested way back in 1914. It's not credited to a specific conspiracy theorist, so I kind of have to assume that it was just like a general like urban legend maybe, or a myth. Raymond Asquith, who was a junior counsel for the Board of Trade at the British inquiry into the sinking, he described the theory in a letter to the Times. The architect, the owner and the captain were partners in an infamous conspiracy to repair their desperate fortunes by sinking the ship and sharing the insurance money. The letter was actually not about the Titanic at all. By the way, it was about Irish Home Rule. He was just using this theory as like an example of outlandish conspiracy theories. He went on to point out the improbability that 100,000 men in Belfast would have to be in on it. He ended his response letter with this: "It is not improbable that some members of our race have too little imagination, but is it impossible that others have too much?" Since Gardner, this conspiracy theory has been expanded upon by the larger conspiracy community, and they've added many additional claims. I'm not going to go through all of them because, like I said, there are a ton, and honestly this video is long enough. I'm just going to go through the ones that seem to be the key points. So the first is the similarity between the two ships. The idea that it would have been easy to switch them. There's a lot of image comparisons that have since surfaced between the two ships, like this one or this one, going, oh, look, it's the Olympic, it's the Titanic. See, here's the thing though. While the two ships were sister ships, and because of that they had a lot of similarities, they also had a huge amount of fundamental differences. The biggest of these was a whole extra reception room in the Titanic's bridge deck B. The propellers of the two ships were completely different. They couldn't have been interchanged. And the Titanic was 4 inches longer than the Olympic, which, I mean, granted at the time probably no one would have noticed, but like, we've since like been to the bottom of the ocean and seen the Titanic. We know now, we know exactly how long it was. The front of the wheelhouse in Olympic's bridge at the time was curved, and on the Titanic it's flat. This theory obviously relies on the switching of the two ships. So they would have not only had to alter the Titanic to match the Olympic, they would have had to alter the Olympic to match the Titanic. And remember, the Olympic had a ton of fanfare. It was so exciting, everybody would have seen it, there would have been pictures all over the place, people would have noticed. Especially the captain of the previous ship, although he's supposed to be in on it, but still. The total time these two ships were together in the dock was 44 days. I think you'd be hard pressed to build a rudimentary house in 44 days, let alone switch over the ins and outs of two massive ocean liners, one of which who had been damaged, so would have needed repairs. It's not a lot of time. This also relies on the idea that somehow all of the workers never snitched. According to a theory by Dr. David Grimes from Oxford University, there is an equation that expresses how long alleged conspiracies could survive before being revealed, deliberately or unwittingly. This equation relies on 3 factors: the number of conspirators involved, the amount of time that's passed, and the intrinsic probability of a conspiracy failing. As far as the comparison images go, like with a lot of viral images and videos, you don't get the full context with them. I'm just going to go through a few because the refutation, is that a word, of all of them is basically the same. So take this one for instance, that points out the name Titanic is in 2 different places and claims that this is because it was covering up where the Olympic would have been. It sounds really compelling, right? But what this actually shows is 2 different stages in the Titanic's construction. That first photo was taken before the name had been engraved in the Titanic at all, because it had been engraved. Remember that claim? Yeah, no, just a straight up lie, that one. There was no plate, it had been engraved. So when that first image was taken, the photographer actually etched over the top of it to just give a more realistic idea of what the ship would look like when it was done. This was written over the top of a photograph. It wasn't actually where the letters were. So this is another one, and it's one people point to often, the portholes. It showed that the Titanic, when it was being built, had 14 bow portholes, whereas the Olympic had 16. The ship that left Southampton had 16. Therefore, it must be the Olympic. That sounds really compelling until you learn that the Titanic had 14 bow portholes when it was launched. But in the following months, while it was being completed, because for some reason ships launch well before their maiden voyage, I guess so they can like whip up a frenzy and get people to buy tickets and stuff, they actually added 2 more portholes for better light and air circulation. So it had 16 when it departed. And there's record of this. Yet another photo comparison, yet another misrepresentation of the facts. So the ship pictured on the left is the ship that launched, remember, months before the Titanic was actually finished. See the even spacing of the windows? The ship on the right, again, the ship that set sail, has obviously very different windows. This is supposed to be because it was a different ship. The windows are different. How could the windows be different? Dude, because the windows weren't finished. They changed a bunch of interior features of the Titanic, which meant changing the configuration of the windows slightly. In this theory, something else that's misrepresented is the amount of damage that the Olympic took when it hit that ship in the first place. Gardner claims that the ship had a bent keel and its turbine mountings had been damaged. And then of course it had a big old hole in the side. This is just straight up speculation. There's literally no evidence of anything more than a gaping hole at the side of the Olympic. At the hearings following the collision, the extent of the damage was agreed upon by White Star and the Royal Navy, who owned the ship that it had hit. They found that the Olympic's hull had a big old 8-foot gash in it, and that's all. No propeller damage, no bent keel. I also want to point out that there's another claim that the propellers were switched between the 2 ships. So the shiny new propeller was taken off the Titanic, put on the Olympic, which they had planned to sink, and then they took the damaged one off the Olympic and put it on the Titanic that they planned to keep in operation for the next 35 years. That doesn't make any sense. Also, old Jimmy Cameron's expedition to the Titanic, well, one of his expeditions, put that one to bed. You can clearly see the Titanic ship number 401 on the propeller at the bottom of the sea. Also, the propellers were completely different. And the Olympic's propeller wasn't even damaged in the first place. And they didn't switch the ships. Okay, so the 1-day sea trial of the Titanic. Bit fishy. Gardner claims that it never reached high speeds for its trial. There is 0 evidence for this, but to better refute this claim, this rests on the idea that the damaged Olympic couldn't handle the high speeds. But it managed to handle them just fine when they were shoveling coal into the furnace and it was barreling along at 22 knots. It was handling it just fine then. The sea trial that only lasted 1 day. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, it was actually planned for 2 days, but there was bad weather that meant that they had to postpone the test, which kind of seems dumb. Like, wouldn't you want to see how it worked in bad weather? But then I guess they didn't want to ruin it before its main voyage. I don't know. It seems silly. In addition to that, they were on a really tight schedule trying to get this ship out for its main voyage, so they didn't have the time to expand and do all these checks and do all this safety stuff. Who needs it? People don't die here, it's fine. Or actually lots of people die. Maybe that's why they were so chill about safety. They were just like, well, people are gonna die anyway. They were sending children up in chimneys and work in factories where their little hands got cut off. I'm sure they didn't really care about safety checks. But yeah, no, I agree. It is a stupidly short test run for a ship that you are charging some people $100,000 for a ticket for. But that's not a conspiracy, that's just bad safety regulations. And many of these actually changed after the Titanic disaster because people realized, like, hey, when you don't care about safety, lots of people die. So why didn't the lookouts notice the iceberg? And how did an iceberg damage the Titanic's double hull? First of all, the Titanic didn't have a double hull. It had double bottom. It was a cruise liner, not a warship. It was expensive enough to produce as it is, and it didn't need the double hull. So this is, again, just more creativity with the facts on the part of Gardner. Thanks, bro. Now, the lookouts. Like I've mentioned, the ice conditions were the worst they had been in 50 years. So from the get-go, they kind of weren't paranoid about icebergs because they didn't know that there would be that many. And again, like I mentioned, the night that they hit the iceberg was insanely clear and still. So there was no wind jostling against the ice. They weren't moving dramatically or anything. Also, they didn't have binoculars. Now, there were binoculars on board the Titanic, but someone had left the key back at port, so they couldn't get in to see them. All these things combined kind of set the lookouts up for really not noticing the dangerous conditions they were sailing into, unless of course someone had warned them. Like there's radio operators that received 6 different ice warning messages from other ships. Kind of like that. Yeah, that would have been nice. So the claim that the ice on deck was actually from like the 2 bits of the ship hitting, there was just way too much ice for this to be the case. And there are a ton of eyewitness accounts of this. And from like seaworthy people too. We've got able-bodied seaman William Lucas saw about a couple tons. Able-bodied seaman Edward John Bully reported a couple tons of blocks of ice. Able-bodied seaman Joseph Scariot was a large quantity of ice and snow, all on the same side of the deck too. They all reported starboard side. And then finally, the idea that the Californian was somehow in on the scheme, that it saw the rockets from the decoy iceberg, aka the mystery ship, and didn't come to the Titanic's aid because it knew exactly what was happening. This really just seems to me like an attempt to understand that humans sometimes make mistakes. There are a ton of cases where things like this happen, where people witness something that seems off or seems dangerous, seems strange, and they do nothing. You know, they hear a scream or a gunshot and they just think, oh, maybe I'm wrong, you know, and they do nothing. I don't think it's outside the scope of human behavior that the captain just dismissed it, not wanting to think that something that horrible was happening. It's nobody's fault, really. People just make mistakes. I don't think it's part of like a horrible conspiracy. I think that's just a bad thing that happened and it was a poor choice and I'm sure he felt awful. So something I want to point out is the wreck of the Titanic was only discovered in 1985, which is only about 10 years before Gardner's book was published. The photos taken during that discovery, because it was 1985 and 2.5 miles underneath the surface of the ocean, were pretty low qual. It wasn't until much later that we saw like high-res photos and video of the wreck. A lot of Gardner's claims relies on the lack of evidence that was present at the time. We know a lot more about the Titanic now, purely just because of the access that we all have to that information and the fact that we can collect that information in the first place. He wouldn't have had that access during his lifetime. Compare those original photos to this footage from the 2004 expedition, and then this footage taken in 2010. And then this footage, taken last year.
First impressions, it's big.
I'll tell you what, Sherlock Holmes, you are unbelievable.
Okay, so apart from that observation, there was also this. There is so much detail in that last one that it like almost hurts your eyes to look at it. You know when you like see a really, really like high definition 5K TV and you're too close to it and you're like, oh no, this is too real, I don't like it. That's kind of what it felt like to watch that footage, not gonna lie. The difference in all these is startling, and the amount of detail available to us now was just not there for Gardner. A lot of the reading I did when researching this treated Gardner as kind of an idiot. I don't think that not having access to this irrefutable evidence that we have nowadays necessarily makes him an idiot. He was clearly a smart man, but being smart doesn't make you immune to getting swept up in like an exciting, like saucy theory. He did ignore and dismiss quite a bit of evidence that was available at the time, but the most concrete evidence, that of the ship at the bottom of the ocean, was largely unavailable to him. The images that he had at the time were pretty garbage. Most conspiracies breed in a void of understanding. And I feel like this is one conspiracy that gets less and less credible as time goes on, simply because we have more information. Again, there are so many claims for this conspiracy theory I could have gone through, but a lot of them require the others, most of which I've addressed, to be true in the first place and kind of add on that. So once one of the main ones is refuted, they sort of do a bit of logical shuffling that I think kind of takes away credibility from this story. My takeaway from this is don't believe every side-by-side comparison you see, because some of them are just lies. To me, this conspiracy theory is kind of reflective of a need to understand tragedies, to stamp some kind of control or blame onto them, but sometimes terrible things just happen. In the case of the Titanic, it was 100 little decisions that led up. It was no one person's fault. It was a domino effect, you know? What if all the ice warnings had been relayed? What if they took them seriously? What if they'd had all the lifeboats and the proper training to use them? What if the binoculars hadn't been locked away? What if there were more crew members with more seafaring experience? What if the Californian had responded to the distress signal? What if the ship hadn't been going so fast? We could sit here and do this for the next 20 minutes. Like, these dominoes were what led to the disaster of the Titanic, not a plot among millionaires to save a couple bucks. Because ultimately, it would have been so expensive to refit both of these ships. It would have outweighed the estimated $135,000 it would have cost to just fix the Olympic and send it back out in sea, which is what they did. Business-wise, it's just not a good choice to make. The Titanic was underinsured by like $2 million. So they wouldn't have even like recouped the cost. Now, this is only one of the conspiracy theories surrounding the Titanic. Like any massive disaster, I think it attracts a lot of speculation. There's theories that it was sunk by a German U-boat, that JP Morgan planned it to kill 3 dudes who wanted to oppose the Federal Reserve Bank for some reason. I don't know a lot about JP Morgan. That there was a Protestant conspiracy to upend Catholicism and it sank because of like bad vibes. Speaking of bad vibes, there's also a theory that it was the mummy's curse that sank the Titanic. I really want to talk about the mummy's curse, by the way, because it's so fascinating.
There are 2 things I know about white people. They love Matchbox 20 and they are terrified of curses.
Then of course there's the actual fact that an author wrote a story 10 years earlier, before this even happened, about a maritime disaster where a shortage of lifeboats causes a massive loss of life on a mail steamer, which is exactly what the Titanic was. And then he was a passenger who died on the Titanic. This video is long enough as it is. Those are all stories for another time. It was fascinating that like this rabbit hole goes even deeper. Thank you so much for watching this video and going down this rabbit hole with me. If you liked it, maybe give it a thumbs up and subscribe. I'll be here every week with a new weird thing to talk about. And if you made it to the end of this video, leave a lifeboat in the comments.